Chapter 1. The Pendulum's Pause. The village of St. Mary's Mead drowsed under a late autumn fog, its cottages huddled like gossiping neighbours. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting needles clicking softly, sat by her window, watching the world through lace curtains. At 72, her eyes were as sharp as her mind, catching the subtle irregularities others missed, like the postman's new limp or the vicar's hurried stride past Pendleton Manor. Pendleton Manor loomed at the village's edge, a Georgian relic with too many chimneys and a reputation for oddity. Its owner, Victor Crane, was a horologist of some renown, though his obsession with time had curdled into something villagers whispered about over teacups. Clocks ticked in every room of the manor, their chimes a constant hymn. So, when Miss Marple noticed their absence during her morning stroll, an uncanny silence where there should have been a cacophony, she paused. Curious, she murmured, her breath misting in the chill. A house of clocks gone quiet. She'd been invited to the manor for tea, a rare summons from Victor, who preferred gears to people. The invitation, penned in his precise hand, had mentioned a matter of some delicacy. Miss Marple, ever attuned to the undercurrents of human nature, suspected more than tea awaited. The manor's oak doors creaked open under the butler's gloved hand. Inside, the air was heavy with polish and dust. The grand foyer housed Victor's prized possession, a towering grandfather clock, its pendulum a gleaming brass disc. But the pendulum hung still, and the clock's face stared blankly, its hands frozen at 11:47. Miss Marple, the butler, a wiry man named Graves, intoned. The others are in the drawing-room. Others? She asked, her tone light but probing. Mr. Crane's guests, a lively bunch. Graves's lips twitched, as if suppressing a grimace. The drawing-room was a study in tension. 5 figures occupied it, their postures stiff, their voices hushed. Miss Marple's gaze swept over them, cataloguing details. A young woman in a green dress, twisting a handkerchief. A portly man with a pocket watch he checked obsessively. A gaunt woman with ink-stained fingers, scribbling in a notebook. A handsome youth polishing a monocle. And a dour man in tweed, staring out of the window. Miss Marple, the young woman in green rose, her smile brittle. I'm Lydia Crane, Victor's niece. He's delayed, I'm afraid. Delayed? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her mind was already turning. In a house ruled by time, that's rather unexpected, the portly man snorted. Victor's probably fussing over some blasted cog. I'm Reginald Holt, his business partner. Waste of a morning, this is. Patience, Reggie, the gaunt woman said, her voice dry as parchment. Clocks don't rush, and neither should we. Clara Voss, journalist, writing Victor's biography. Youth with the monocle smirked. If he ever shows up. Julian Drake at your service. I'm here for, let's call it a debt Victor owes me. The doorman in tweed didn't turn from the window. Arthur Wren, I collect rare clocks. Victor promised me a look at his Foucault pendulum gear. Where is he? Miss Marple settled into a chair, her knitting in her lap. A Foucault pendulum gear. Quite rare, I believe, used to demonstrate the Earth's rotation. Wren's head snapped toward her, surprised. You know of it? Oh, I pick up odds and ends, she said airily, though her mind filed away his reaction. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint creak of the manor's timbers. Then a scream shattered the air, high, raw, and unmistakably Graves's. The group surged toward the foyer, Miss Marple trailing with deceptive calm. There, beneath the grandfather clock, hung Victor Crane. His body swayed gently, tied to the pendulum's weight by a silken rope. His face was ashen, his eyes wide, and a single clock gear, a jagged golden piece, jutted from his chest like an accusation. The pendulum, now moving, ticked with a slow, deliberate rhythm, as if mocking the stillness of the man it carried. Lydia gasped, clutching Julian's arm. Reginald swore under his breath. Clara's pen scratched furiously. Wren stared, unblinking. Miss Marple stepped closer, her gaze darting from the gear to the clock's frozen hands. Still 11:47. "Graves," she said softly, "when did you last see Mr. Crane?" The butler, pale and trembling, stammered, "Last night, ma'am. He was in his study working late. I locked the doors at 10. And this clock," she pressed, "when did it stop?" Graves hesitated. I don't know. It was ticking yesterday." Miss Marple's lips pursed. A house of clocks, silenced. A man killed with his own obsession. And a pendulum that swung only after death. She glanced at the guests, their faces a gallery of shock, fear, and perhaps guile. "Well," she said, her voice as mild as ever, "it seems we have a puzzle. And I do so enjoy a puzzle." Chapter 2. The Guests of Time. The foyer of Pendleton Manor buzzed with the nervous energy of a wound spring. Victor Crane's body had been cut down from the grandfather clock and laid on a velvet chaise, the golden gear still protruding from his chest like a grotesque medal. The pendulum, now stilled again, hung heavy, its brass disc catching the flickering light of a chandelier. Miss Marple stood apart, her knitting needles idle in her hands, her eyes flitting from face to face as the guests whispered and paced. "Barbaric," Reginald Holt muttered, mopping his brow with a handkerchief. "Who'd do such a thing to Victor? The man was a genius." "A genius with enemies," Clara Voss said, her pen poised over her notebook. "You don't amass a fortune in rare clocks without stepping on toes, Reggie." Lydia Crane, pale as porcelain, clutched a locket at her throat. "He was my uncle. He didn't deserve this." Julian Drake, leaning against a marble pillar, raised an eyebrow. "Didn't he?" Victor had a knack for making promises he didn't keep. Debts, Lydia, not just money, secrets. Arthur Wren, still by the window, turned sharply. "Enough speculation. We're not detectives. Where's the blasted constable?" Miss Marple's voice, soft but clear, cut through the din. "The constable will come, Mr. Wren. But while we wait, perhaps we might learn something. Grief and guilt have a way of loosening tongues." The room stilled, 5 pairs of eyes fixed on her, some wary, some curious. Graves, hovering by, the door coughed nervously. "Guilt?" Reginald blustered. "What's that supposed to mean, Miss Marple? I was in my room all night, as was everyone, I presume." "Were you?" Miss Marple's smile was serene, but her gaze pinned him like a butterfly. A house this size with so many corridors. One might wander unnoticed. Lydia's locket slipped from her fingers, clattering to the floor. Julian stooped to retrieve it, his fingers brushing hers as he murmured, "Careful, darling, you're shaking." "I'm fine," Lydia snapped, snatching the locket back. "It's just this house, the clocks. They've always unnerved me." Clara's eyes narrowed. "You grew up here, didn't you? Victor raised you after your parents died. Odd that his home unsettles you now." "Enough, Clara," Lydia said, her voice brittle. "You're not writing a novel. This is my family." "Is it?" Clara's tone was icy. "Victor was no saint, Lydia. My research on him turned up irregularities, missing funds, forged provenances for his clocks. Care to comment?" Reginald rounded on her. "Slander? Victor's business was above board. I handled his accounts myself." "Then why?" Julian drawled. "Did he owe me £10,000? A gambling debt, he said, he'd settle this week. Convenient timing for him to expire." Miss Marple's needles clicked once, a deliberate sound. "Mr. Drake, you seem remarkably composed for a man owed such a sum. And you, Mr. Wren," she added, turning to the collector, "you mentioned a Foucault pendulum gear. Was it worth killing for?" Wren's jaw tightened. "I'm a scholar, not a murderer. That gear is a relic, priceless to those who understand it. Victor teased me with it, said he'd sell it to the highest bidder." "Priceless," Miss Marple echoed, her tone thoughtful. "And yet one just like it is lodged in Mr. Crane's chest. Curious, don't you think?" The room fell silent, save for the distant creak of the manor's timbers. Graves cleared his throat. "Miss Marple, the constable's delayed by the fog. He'll be here by noon." "Noon," she mused. "Plenty of time, then. Mr. Graves, could you show me to Mr. Crane's study? I'd like to see where he spent his final hours." The butler hesitated, then nodded. "This way, ma'am." As they left the foyer, Miss Marple glanced back. Lydia clutched her locket, staring at the clock. Reginald whispered furiously to Clara, who scribbled without looking up. Julian polished his monocle, a smirk playing on his lips. Wren's gaze lingered on the pendulum, his fingers twitching. The study was a shrine to time. Clocks lined the walls, cuckoos, mantles, pocket watches in glass cases. Yet all were silent, their hands frozen at various hours. A mahogany desk bore papers, a spilled inkpot, and a single sheet with scrawled words. "The pendulum swings true at midnight." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Midnight," she murmured, "and yet the foyer clock says 11:47. Tell me, Graves, did Mr. Crane ever tamper with his clocks?" "Never, ma'am," Graves said, his voice low. "He said time was sacred, but last night he was agitated, kept muttering about the society and debts unpaid." "The society," she pressed. Graves looked away. I don't know, ma'am. He was private about his affairs." Miss Marple nodded, her mind whirring. A society, a debt, a pendulum that swung only for death. She picked up a small brass key from the desk, its teeth worn and intricate. "Graves," she said, "lock this room, and tell the others to gather for lunch. People reveal themselves when they eat." As the butler led her out, Miss Marple tucked the key into her reticule. The manor's silence pressed against her, but beneath it she sensed the faint tick of truth, waiting to be wound. Chapter 3. The Ticking Alibi. The dining room of Pendleton Manor was a cavern of oak and candlelight, its long table set with china that gleamed under a patina of disuse. Miss Marple sat at one end, her knitting folded neatly beside her, her eyes as bright as the silverware. The guests summoned for lunch shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their appetites dulled by the morning's horror. Victor Crane's absence hung over them like a stopped clock, and the golden gear, now in the constable's custody, who had finally arrived, cast a long shadow. Constable Harrow, a ruddy man with a moustache that bristled like a hedgehog, stood by the door, notebook in hand. "I'll need statements from each of you," he said gruffly. "Time of deaths estimated between 10 last night and midnight, based on, well, the state of things. Where were you all?" Reginald Holt coughed, his jowls quivering. "In my room, as I said, reading ledgers. Dull stuff, but it kept me up till 11. Heard nothing." Clara Voss arched an eyebrow, her fork poised over a slice of cold ham. "Ledgers, Reggie. Or were you snooping in Victor's study again? I saw you near there last week, looking shifty." "Preposterous!" Reginald snapped, his face reddening. "I was verifying accounts. Victor trusted me." "Did he?" Julian Drake's voice was smooth as oil, his monocle glinting. "I was in the billiard room, practicing shots, alone, sadly. But I heard a door slam around the 10:30. Thought it was Victor, storming about as usual." Lydia Crane's hands trembled as she poured tea, the cup rattling against its saucer. "I was in my room, too. I took a sleeping draught. The clocks, they keep me awake. I didn't hear anything." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Lydia's locket, which she clutched like a talisman. "A sleeping draught, Miss Crane? Strong enough to drown out a scream?" Lydia flushed. It usually is." Arthur Wren, picking at his plate, spoke, without looking up. "I was in the library cataloguing Victor's clock manuals. He'd promised me access to his Foucault gear. I stayed till midnight, then went to bed. No screams, no slams." Constable Harrow scribbled, then frowned. "This gear, the murder weapon. Rare, you said, Mr. Wren. How rare?" Wren's fingers tightened on his fork. "Extremely. It's a Foucault pendulum component, crafted in the 18th century. Only a dozen exist. Victor owned 2, one in his collection, one— well, you saw where the other ended up." Miss Marple's voice was mild, but her words cut like a scalpel. "2 gears, Mr. Wren, and yet only one was in Mr. Crane's chest. Where is the second?" Wren blinked, caught off guard. I don't know. In his safe, perhaps. He was secretive about his treasures." "Secretive," Miss Marple echoed, her eyes flicking to the others. "And yet someone knew exactly where to find that gear. Someone with access, perhaps, or opportunity." Clara set her pen down, her gaze sharp. "Access? Like Lydia, who lived here. Or Reggie, who handled Victor's books. Or even Julian, who's been cozying up to Victor for months, sniffing out his debts." Julian laughed a cold sound. "Cozying? Hardly. Victor owed me, Clara, and I wasn't the only one. Ask Lydia about her uncle's investments. She might know more than she lets on." Lydia's teacup clattered, spilling amber liquid. "Stop it! I don't know anything about his money. He kept me out of it." "Enough!" Constable Harrow barked. "Miss Marple, you've been poking about. Got any theories?" Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking once for emphasis. "Only observations, Constable. For instance, the foyer clock stopped at 11:47, yet Mr. Crane's study clocks were frozen at different hours. And that note, "The pendulum swings true at midnight," suggests a plan. A precise one. Harrow grunted. Precision, eh? Sounds like our killer knew clocks as well as Crane did. Indeed, Miss Marple said, which is why I'd like to see the safe, Mr. Graves. The second gear may tell us something. Graves, serving soup, nearly dropped the ladle. The safe, ma'am? It's in the study, but only Mr. Crane had the combination. Did he? Miss Marple's fingers brushed the brass key in her reticule. We shall see. As lunch dissolved into murmurs, Miss Marple watched the guests. Reginald's bluster hid a flicker of fear. Clara's scribbling seemed less curious, more calculated. Julian's smirk was too practised, Lydia's distress too raw. And Wren's eyes kept darting to the door, as if expecting the pendulum to swing again. After lunch, Miss Marple followed Graves to the study, Constable Harrow in tow. The safe, hidden behind a portrait of a stern-faced Crane ancestor, was a steel monolith. Miss Marple produced the brass key, its teeth glinting. Not the combination, Harrow said, puzzled. What's it for? A hunch, Miss Marple replied, scanning the room. Her gaze settled on a small clock on the mantel, its hands stuck at midnight. She inserted the key into a slot beneath its base. A click echoed, and a panel in the safe popped open. Inside lay a velvet box. Harrow opened it, revealing the second Foucault gear, identical to the murder weapon, save for a faint engraving, Tempus Fugit. Time flies, Miss Marple murmured. But for whom? Harrow's moustache twitched. This complicates things. 2 gears, 1 killer, and a house full of liars. Miss Marple nodded, her mind ticking like the clocks that no longer did. The alibis were fragile, the motives tangled, and somewhere, in the gap between 11:47 and midnight, lay the truth. Chapter 4. Shadows on the Dial. The dining room of Pendleton Manor glowed with the flicker of candelabras, their light casting long shadows that danced across the panelled walls. The clocks, still silent, seemed to watch the guests as they gathered for dinner, their faces taut with suspicion. Miss Marple, seated between Lydia Crane and Arthur Wren, observed the scene with the calm of a gardener studying weeds. The second, Foucault gear, now locked in Constable Harrow's evidence bag, had tightened the noose of doubt around them all. The constable, dining with them at Miss Marple's insistence, cleared his throat. I've sent for a clock expert from London to examine that gear. Might tell us who had the skill to use it as a weapon. Until then, nobody leaves the manor. Reginald Holt slammed his wineglass down, sloshing claret. Confined like criminals? I've a business to run, Harrow. This is outrageous. Is it? Clara Voss's voice was a blade, her notebook open beside her plate. You were quick to defend Victor's accounts, Reggie, but I found a ledger in his study. Discrepancies, thousands missing. Care to explain? Reginald's jowls quivered. You snooped in his private papers? That's libel, Clara. I'll have your job. Try it, she shot back, her eyes glinting. Victor was no saint, and you knew it. His business was a house of cards. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused, her voice soft but piercing. Miss Voss, you mentioned irregularities in Mr. Crane's affairs. Did your research uncover anything unusual? A group, perhaps, that he associated with. Clara hesitated, her pen stilling. There were rumours. A society, clockmakers, collectors, fanatics. They called themselves the Order of the Pendulum. Victor bragged about it once, said they guarded time's secrets. I thought it was nonsense. Arthur Wren's fork clattered to his plate. The Order! That's a myth, Miss Marple. A story collectors tell to inflate their egos. Victor was no cultist. Wasn't he? Julian Drake leaned back, his monocle catching the candlelight. Victor loved his secrets. That gear in his chest. A message, perhaps. The Order doesn't take kindly to traitors. Lydia Crane's voice was barely a whisper. Stop it, Julian. There's no society. Uncle Victor was just eccentric. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Lydia's locket, which gleamed as she clutched it. Eccentric, Miss Crane? Or cautious? That note in his study, the pendulum swings true at midnight, suggests he expected trouble. Did he ever mention this order to you? Lydia's eyes darted away. No, he kept things from me, said it was for my safety. Safety, Miss Marple murmured, filing the word away. She turned to Graves, who hovered by the sideboard, pouring coffee. Mr. Graves, you mentioned Mr. Crane's agitation last night. Did he receive any visitors? Letters, perhaps? Graves's hands trembled, spilling a drop of coffee. A letter, ma'am. Delivered at dusk. No sender's name, just a wax seal, a pendulum, embossed. He burned it after reading. A pendulum seal, Miss Marple said, her tone light but her mind racing. How distinctive. Constable Harrow frowned, scribbling in his notebook. This order business sounds like a fairy tale. But that gear, the note, the stopped clocks, someone's playing a game. Miss Marple, you found that key. Any more hunches? She smiled, her needles clicking rhythmically. Only that dinner is a fine place for truths to slip. For instance, Mr. Drake, you heard a door slam at 10:30. Which door? Julian blinked, caught off guard. The west wing, I think, near the study. Near the study, Miss Marple echoed, her eyes flicking to Reginald, who'd claimed to be in his room. And you, Miss Voss, saw Mr. Holt there last week. Was it at night? Clara's lips twitched. Evening. He was leaving the study, looking like he'd seen a ghost. Lies, Reginald roared, but his voice cracked. I was checking inventory. Room fell silent, the tension thick as the fog outside. Miss Marple's gaze swept over them. Lydia's trembling fingers, Julian's calculated calm, Clara's predatory stare, Wren's sudden pallor, Reginald's sweat-beaded brow. Each held a piece of the puzzle, but the picture was still obscured. After dinner, as the guests dispersed, Miss Marple lingered in the foyer, her eyes on the grandfather clock. Its hands remained at 11:47, but something caught her attention. A faint scratch on the pendulum's brass disc, barely visible. She leaned closer, her fingers brushing the metal. The scratch formed a symbol. A tiny, edged pendulum, identical to Graves's description of the letter's seal. Curious, she whispered. She glanced at the staircase, where Lydia's shadow vanished into the gloom, her locket glinting one last time. Back in her room, Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting untouched. The Order of the Pendulum, a burned letter, a gear that killed, and a clock that lied about time. She closed her eyes. her mind ticking through the shadows on the dial, each shadow a step closer to midnight. Chapter 5. The Midnight Swing. The fog pressed thicker against Pendleton Manor's windows, turning the world beyond into a grey void. Inside, the foyer glowed with the dim light of oil lamps, their flames flickering like nervous pulses. Miss Marple stood before the grandfather clock, its hands still frozen at 11:47, the pendulum motionless since Victor Crane's body was removed. Constable Harrow, the guests and Graves gathered around her, their faces a mix of scepticism and unease. The clock expert from London was delayed by the weather, leaving Miss Marple to take the lead. "I propose," she said, her voice as gentle as a lullaby, "a reenactment. To understand how Mr. Crane met his end, we must recreate the night's events. The pendulum, you see, is the key. Reenactment?" Reginald Holt blustered, his tie askew. "This isn't a theatre, Miss Marple. It's ghoulish." "Ghoulish, perhaps," she replied, her eyes twinkling, "but illuminating. The note in Mr. Crane's study said, 'The pendulum swings true at midnight.' Yet this clock stopped at 11:47. Why?" Clara Voss, clutching her notebook, smirked. "You think the killer tampered with it? A clock in a house full of them? Bold or precise?" Miss Marple said, her gaze sweeping the group. "Mr. Graves, can you set the clock to 11:47 and start the pendulum? Let's see what happens." Graves hesitated, his gloved hands hovering over the clock's weights. "Ma'am, it's not been wound since last night. Mr. Crane was particular about its rhythm." "Indulge me," she said, her tone firm but kind. With a nod, Graves adjusted the weights and set the pendulum in motion. Its slow, deliberate swing filled the foyer with a deep, resonant tick-tock, each beat like a heartbeat. The guests watched, transfixed, as the hands crept toward 11:48. Lydia Crane clutched her locket, her voice trembling. "It's too loud. It's always been too loud." Julian Drake, leaning against the banister, raised an eyebrow. "Sensitive, darling? Or guilty? You were asleep during all this, weren't you?" "Leave her alone," Arthur Wren snapped, his usually dour face flushed. "We're all on edge. This clock nonsense proves nothing." "Doesn't it?" Miss Marple's needles clicked once, a punctuation. "Constable Harrow, could you mark the time? I'd like to know when the pendulum reaches its 50th swing." Harrow, puzzled but compliant, counted under his breath as the pendulum swung. At the 50th swing, he glanced at his pocket watch. 11:52, Miss Marple. 5 minutes past." 5 minutes, she murmured, and yet the note spoke of midnight. "Mr. Graves, how long does it take to reach the study from here?" Graves blinked. "A minute, ma'am. Less if you hurry." "And to tie a rope? To stage such a scene?" Her voice was soft, but the question hung heavy. 3 minutes, perhaps, Graves said, his eyes darting to the floor. Miss Marple nodded, her mind whirring. "So, from 11:47 to midnight, there's time enough for murder." But the clock stopped. Why stop it at all? Clara's pen scratched furiously. "To confuse us. The killer wanted us to think the murder happened earlier. An alibi, maybe." "Or a message," Julian drawled, polishing his monocle. "Victor's precious order of." The pendulum loved their symbols. That gear, the note, the clock. Ritualistic, don't you think? Lydia's locket slipped from her fingers, clattering to the floor again. She knelt to retrieve it, her face pale. "There's no order. It's just stories." Miss Marple stooped to help, her fingers brushing Lydia's. The locket popped open, revealing a tiny clock face, its hands stuck at midnight. "A curious keepsake, Miss Crane," she said, her tone gentle but probing. "A gift from your uncle?" Lydia snapped the locket shut. "Yes, he said it was special. I don't know why." The pendulum's rhythm faltered, the clock chiming a single hollow note. Everyone froze. Graves rushed to the mechanism, his hands shaking. "It's caught," he muttered, peering inside. "A cog's loose." Miss Marple joined him, her eyes narrowing at the clock's innards. Tucked behind the pendulum's weight was a folded scrap of paper, its edges singed. She plucked it out with a handkerchief, unfolding it carefully. Scrawled in Victor's precise hand were the words, "The Order knows. Midnight betrays." Constable Harrow snatched the note, his moustache twitching. "Another riddle. This Order business is real, then?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her gaze flicking to Wren, whose fingers twitched as if itching to seize the paper. "Or a distraction. Mr. Wren, you dismissed the Order as a myth, yet this note suggests Mr. Crane feared it." Wren's jaw tightened. He was paranoid. Collectors are. That gear was worth a fortune, enough to make anyone nervous. "Enough to kill for?" Miss Marple asked, her voice mild. Wren said nothing, his eyes locked on the pendulum, now still again. Reginald coughed, breaking the silence. "This is madness. Notes, societies, clocks, it's all to throw us off. I say we search the rooms. The killer's got to have evidence." "Search away," Julian said, smirking. "But you won't find my £10,000. Victor's secrets died with him." Miss Marple's lips pursed. "Not all secrets, Mr. Drake. The pendulum swings, and it points somewhere. Constable, keep that note safe. And Mr. Graves, lock the clock. We wouldn't want it tampered with." As the group dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes on the clock's face. The reenactment had revealed more than time. It had exposed fear, lies, and a locket that ticked at midnight. The order of the pendulum, real or not, cast a shadow. And in that shadow she sensed the killer's misstep. A tick too soon or too late. Chapter 6. Hands of the Past. The library of Pendleton Manor was a vault of shadows, its shelves heavy with leather-bound tomes and the faint musk of old paper. Miss Marple sat at a polished table, a single oil lamp casting a golden pool around her. Constable Harrow had granted her access to Victor Crane's personal papers, hoping to uncover more about the elusive Order of the Pendulum. The guests, confined to their rooms under Harrow's orders, left the manor eerily quiet, save for the occasional groan of its ancient timbers. Miss Marple's fingers traced the edges of a locked diary, its cover embossed with a pendulum symbol. The brass key from Victor's study fit perfectly, clicking open the clasp. Inside, Victor's precise handwriting chronicled his life, but it was a bundle of letters tucked into the back that drew her attention. They were yellowed, some dated 20 years prior, and addressed to a Margaret Wren. "Wren," Miss Marple murmured, her eyes narrowing. She glanced at the door, ensuring she was alone, then began to read. Letter, dated April 15th, 1905, my dearest Margaret, the Order has accepted me. but at a cost. They demand loyalty above all, above family, above love. I've secured the Foucault. Gear, but its price was your brother's ruin. His workshop, his reputation. I had no choice. The order's reach is long, and I am bound. Forgive me. Yours, Victor. Miss Marple's lips pursed. Margaret Wren, likely a relation to Arthur Wren, the clock collector. She turned to the diary, flipping to an entry from 1906. Diary entry, June 3rd, 1906. Margaret came to the manor tonight, her eyes wild with grief. Her brother Thomas took his life after the scandal. She blames me, and rightly so. I sold his designs to the order, passing them as my own to gain their favour. The Foucault gear was my reward, but it's cursed. She swore vengeance, said her family would never forget. I fear what her daughter might inherit, not just her name, but her hatred. Daughter, Miss Marple whispered. Her mind ticked like a metronome, connecting threads. Arthur Wren had spoken of the Foucault gear with reverence, but also bitterness. Was he Margaret's son? Or perhaps another relation? She opened another letter, this one from Margaret to Victor, dated 1907. Letter, dated September 12th, 1907, Victor. You've taken everything, my brother, my future. The order may shield you, but time betrays all. My daughter Clara will know the truth. She'll carry my name and my justice. You'll never escape the pendulum's swing. Margaret Wren. Miss Marple's breath caught. Clara, she said softly. Clara Voss, the journalist whose ink-stained fingers and relentless probing had stirred the pot. Was Voss her married name, or a pseudonym to hide her past? She closed the diary, her fingers lingering on the pendulum symbol. The pieces were aligning. Victor's betrayal of Thomas Wren, Margaret's vow, and now Clara's presence, digging into Victor's secrets. But Arthur Wren's role remained murky. Was he a grieving brother, a vengeful cousin, or something else? The library door creaked open, and Graves entered, his face pale. Miss Marple, the constable's asking for you. There's a development. She tucked the letters into her reticule, her expression serene. Thank you, Mr. Graves. What sort of development? He swallowed. Miss Voss. She's found something in the attic, a box, sealed with that pendulum mark. She's insisting you see it. Miss Marple followed Graves through the manor's labyrinthine halls, her mind racing. The attic was a dusty maze of crates and cobwebs lit by a single lantern. Clara stood beside a wooden box, its lid pried open, her eyes gleaming with triumph. Constable Harrow, Lydia, and Julian hovered nearby, while Reginald and Arthur lingered at the edges, their faces guarded. Look, Clara said, thrusting a document at Miss Marple. It's a contract, signed by Victor and the Order of the Pendulum. He sold forged clocks to museums using my father's designs. My father, Thomas Wren! Miss Marple's eyes flicked to Arthur, who stiffened. Your father, Miss Voss. I thought Wren was your maiden name. Clara's jaw tightened. It is. I kept it to honour him. Victor ruined him, drove him to suicide. I came here to expose him, but someone beat me to it. Clara, Arthur said, his voice low, you never told me. I'm your cousin. Margaret was my mother. The room stilled, the revelation hanging like a pendulum at its apex. Lydia's locket glinted as she stepped back, her eyes wide. Julian's smirk faded, replaced by a calculating stare. Reginald coughed, muttering about family dramas. Miss Marple's voice cut through the tension. "Miss Voss, this contract is damning, but it doesn't name the killer. And you, Mr. Wren, knew of your mother's grudge?" Arthur nodded, his face ashen. "I did, but I wanted the gear, not Victor's life. I thought I could buy it, reclaim our families. Honour, honour," Miss Marple echoed, her gaze sweeping the group. "A powerful motive, as powerful as revenge or debt or fear." Her eyes lingered on Lydia, whose fingers trembled on her locket. Harrow took the contract, frowning. "This order's real, then, and they've got a stake in this. Miss Marple, you've read those papers. Any leads?" She smiled, her needles clicking once. "Only that the past ticks louder than the present, Constable. Miss Voss, Mr. Wren, your families. Pain is clear, but someone used that pain to stop a heart, and I suspect they're in this room." As Graves led them back downstairs, Miss Marple's mind churned. The hands of the past had wound the present's crime, but the pendulum's swing was not yet done. Clara's revelation, Arthur's connection, and Lydia's silent locket all pointed to a truth still hidden in the gap between 11:47 and midnight. Chapter 7. The Broken Cog. The morning sun pierced the fog, casting a pale glow over Pendleton, Manor's grounds. Miss Marple stood on the lawn, her shawl tight against the chill, gazing up at the Manor's clock tower. Its face, usually a beacon of precision, was marred by a jagged crack, and its hands hung limp at 3:14. Below, a pile of twisted gears and shattered glass littered the grass, the wreckage of a deliberate act. Constable Harrow knelt beside it, his face grim. "Sabotage," he growled, holding up a mangled cog. "Someone took a wrench to the mechanism last night. After all this clock nonsense, it's no coincidence." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Indeed, Constable, a second crime meant to distract or to destroy evidence. The tower's clock was ticking yesterday, was it not?" "Aye," Harrow said. "Graves checked it at dusk, working fine. This happened after midnight." She nodded, her mind ticking faster than the broken clock. The guests, summoned from their rooms gathered nearby, their faces a gallery of shock and suspicion. Lydia Crane clutched her locket, her eyes red-rimmed. Clara Voss scribbled in her notebook, her jaw set. Julian Drake polished his monocle, his smirk absent. Reginald Holt mopped his brow, muttering about vandals. Arthur Wren stared at the wreckage, his hands clenched. "Who'd do this?" Lydia whispered, her voice trembling. It's like they're mocking Uncle Victor's work." "Mocking," Miss Marple echoed, her tone thoughtful. "Or silencing. Mr. Graves, did the tower clock have any unique features?" Graves, hovering at the edge of the group, cleared his throat. "It was Mr. Crane's pride, ma'am. Synchronized with the foyer clock, down to the second. He said it was his second heart." "Curious," Miss Marple said, her gaze flicking to the suspects. A second heart, stopped like the first. "Constable, may I examine the cog?" Harrow handed her the twisted metal, its edges etched with the now familiar pendulum symbol. She turned it over, noting a faint inscription, Veritas Temporis. Truth of time. Her lips pursed. The order of the pendulum, real or not, was leaving its mark. Clara stepped forward, her voice sharp. "This is no accident. Someone knew the tower's importance. Reggie, you were always poking around Victor's machines. Care to confess?" Reginald's face purpled. "Me? I'm no mechanic. I handle numbers, not wrenches. You're the one digging up dirt, Clara. Maybe you wanted to bury something." "Enough," Harrow barked. "Miss Marple, you've got a knack for this. Any theories?" She smiled, her knitting needles clicking once. "Only that destruction reveals as much as discovery. The tower's sabotage narrows our suspects. Someone with strength, access, and knowledge of its workings. Mr. Wren, you're a collector. Did you ever study this clock?" Arthur's eyes narrowed. "I admired it, yes, but I didn't touch it. I was in my room last night, as I told you." "Were you?" Miss Marple's tone was mild, but her gaze was steel. "Miss Voss, you mentioned seeing Mr. Holt near the study last week. Did you ever see anyone near the tower?" Clara hesitated, her pen stilling. "Once. Julian, 2 nights ago. He was coming down the tower stairs, looking pleased with himself. Julian's monocle flashed as he laughed, a cold sound. Spying Clara. I was exploring. Victor owed me money, not secrets. The tower's view is splendid at dusk." "Liar!" Clara snapped. "You're always sneaking about, sniffing for leverage." Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Lydia, who stood silent, her locket glinting. "Miss Crane, you grew up here. Did your uncle ever show you the tower's mechanism?" Lydia flinched. "Once, when I was a child, it scared me. All those gears like teeth. I haven't been up there in years." The group fell silent, the weight of accusation heavy. Miss Marple turned to Harrow. "Constable, I'd like to visit the village. A chat with the locals might clarify things. Gossip, you see, is often truer than alibis." Harrow grunted. "Fine, but I'm coming with you. Nobody's slipping off." An hour later, Miss Marple sat in the cosy tea-room of St. Mary's Mead, sipping Earl Grey with Mrs. Bantry, the village's unofficial historian. Harrow waited by the door, eyeing his watch. "Victor Crane," Mrs. Bantry said, her eyes sparkling with relish, "was a charmer, but ruthless. Ruined poor Thomas Wren, you know. Stole his designs, left him penniless. Thomas's daughter, Clara, was a firebrand even as a girl. Swore she'd make Victor pay." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking. "And Arthur Wren, Margaret's son, Clara's cousin. Quiet, but obsessed with clocks, like his Uncle Thomas. Came to the village last year, asking about Victor's collection. Odd pair, those Wrens. Oh, and that Julian Drake, shady type. My maid saw him with Lydia Crane at the inn, whispering like lovers months back." "Lovers," Miss Marple murmured, her mind whirring. How illuminating. Back at the manor, she confronted the guests in the drawing-room. "A curious connection has emerged," she said, her voice soft but commanding. "Mr. Drake, you and Miss Crane were seen together, intimately, some time ago. Care to explain?" Lydia's face drained of colour. It was nothing. A mistake. I ended it." Julian shrugged, his smirk returning. "A fling, Miss Marple. Hardly a motive for murder." "Perhaps," she said, her eyes locking on Lydia's locket. "But secrets tick louder than clocks, and this tower's ruin suggests someone feared what it might tell." As the guests dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her gaze on the tower's broken face. Clara and Arthur's shared past, Julian and Lydia's hidden affair, Reginald's evasions, all cogs in a machine that had jammed. The truth, she sensed, lay in the silence between ticks, waiting for the pendulum to swing once more. Chapter 8. The Hour of Truth. The drawing-room of Pendleton Manor was a crucible of tension, its air thick with the scent of wax and suspicion. Miss Marple stood by the fireplace, her knitting folded in her lap, her eyes as bright as the flames behind her. The guests summoned by Constable Harrow sat in a semicircle, their faces etched with dread. The grandfather clock in the foyer, repaired by Graves under Miss Marple's instructions, ticked ominously, its pendulum swinging with a steady tick-tock. It was set to chime at 11:47, the hour frozen on the night of Victor Crane's murder. "I've gathered you here," Miss Marple began, her voice soft but commanding, "because the truth, like a clock, runs on precision. Tonight we'll let the clocks speak." Reginald Holt shifted, his jowls quivering. "Clocks? This is nonsense. We've been over every gear, every note. The killer's long gone." "Gone?" Miss Marple's smile was serene, but her gaze pinned him. "No, Mr. Holt, the killer is here among us, and they've made a mistake." Clara Voss's pen paused, her eyes narrowing. "A mistake? You've got something, don't you? Spill it, Miss Marple." "All in good time, Miss Voss," she replied, her needles clicking once. "Constable Harrow, please ensure the doors are locked. We wouldn't want interruptions." Harrow nodded, posting Graves by the entrance. The guests exchanged wary glances. Lydia Crane clutched her locket, her knuckles white. Julian Drake's monocle glinted, his smirk strained. Arthur Wren's fingers twitched, as if tracing invisible gears. Miss Marple stepped to the centre, holding the singed note from the clock. "The order knows. Midnight betrays." "This note," she said, "was meant to mislead. But it's the clocks that tell the true story. Mr. Graves, wind the drawing-room clock to 11:47 and let it run." Graves obeyed, the smaller clock on the mantel springing to life with a delicate tick-tick. The foyer clock's deeper rhythm echoed in sync, their combined beats filling the room like a pulse. The guests watched, transfixed, as the hands crept toward 11:48. "The reenactment showed us," Miss Marple continued, "that from 11:47 to midnight there was time to kill and stage the scene. But the foyer clock stopped. Why? To hide the true hour of death, or to point to it?" Julian leaned forward, his voice low. "You're saying the killer set the clock to 11:47? Risky, in a house full of people." "Risky, Mr. Drake," she agreed, "but clever. Except for one detail, the tower clock. It was synchronized with the foyer, yet it was sabotaged last night. Why destroy it now?" Lydia's voice was barely audible. To cover something up." "Precisely," Miss Marple said, her eyes locking on Lydia's locket. "Something the tower might have revealed. A sound, perhaps, or a shadow." The clocks chimed 11:49. The room seemed to hold its breath. Clara's pen scratched, then stopped. "You're baiting them," she said, half admiring. "You think the killer will crack." "I hope so," Miss Marple said, her tone mild. "Let's test it. Mr. Wren, you coveted the Foucault gear. Did you ever visit the tower to study its mechanism?" Arthur's face paled. "I told you, I admired it from afar. I didn't sabotage it." And you, Mr. Holt, she turned to Reginald, your accounts hid Victor's frauds. Did you fear the tower's records? Its maintenance logs, perhaps, would expose you, Reginald spluttered. Logs? I'm no vandal. I was in my room. The clocks hit 11:50. A faint creak sounded from the foyer, barely audible over the ticking. Miss Marple's head tilted, her eyes narrowing. Graves, check the clock. Graves hurried out, returning moments later, his face ashen. The pendulum stopped again, ma'am. A wire's been cut. The room erupted. Reginald pointed at Julian. You were in the tower 2 nights ago. Sneaking, always sneaking. Julian's smirk vanished. I explored, yes, but I didn't touch the clocks. Ask Lydia. She knows I'm no mechanic. Lydia's locket fell to the floor, its clasp snapping open. The tiny clock face gleamed, its hands at midnight. She froze, her eyes wide. I didn't mean to. Lydia, Miss Marple said gently, stepping closer. You've carried that locket like a burden. What didn't you mean? Tears spilled down Lydia's cheeks. I killed him, she whispered, her voice breaking. Uncle Victor, he was going to sell me to the Order, to settle his debts. I found the gear in his study and I stabbed him. I stopped the clock to confuse the time. I'm sorry. The room stilled, the confession like a chime at midnight. Harrow lunged forward, cuffs in hand. Lydia Crane, you're under arrest. Clara's pen fell, her face a mask of shock. Julian's monocle dropped, his composure shattered. Arthur stared, his hands trembling. Reginald exhaled, relief flooding his face. Miss Marple, however, remained still, her eyes on Lydia's locket. A brave confession, Miss Crane, she said softly, but too neat. The pendulum swings, but not for you. Harrow paused, cuffs hovering. What? She confessed? She did, Miss Marple said, her voice steady. But the clocks tell a different story. The tower's sabotage, the wire just cut. Lydia was here with us. Someone else tampered tonight. Someone protecting her, or framing her. The guests gasped, their eyes darting to one another. The clocks, now silent, seemed to mock their certainty. Miss Marple's gaze swept the room, her mind ticking through the lies, the gears, the shadows. The hour of truth had come, but the final stroke was yet to fall. Chapter 9. The Silent Stroke. The drawing-room of Pendleton Manor was a tableau of frozen faces, the air heavy with the aftershock of Lydia Crane's confession. The grandfather clock, in the foyer, its wire freshly cut, stood silent, its pendulum as still as the truth Miss Marple now held. Constable Harrow, cuffs in hand, hovered over Lydia, but his eyes were on Miss Marple, whose calm demeanour belied the storm of deduction. In her mind, the guests, Clara Voss, Julian Drake, Arthur Wren, Reginald Holt, and Graves, watched, their breaths shallow, as if awaiting the final chime. Lydia, Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but unyielding. You spoke bravely, but your story doesn't fit the pendulum's swing. The clocks, you see, never lie. Only people do. Lydia sobbed. Her locket clutched to her chest. I had to protect myself. Uncle Victor was a monster. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, her eyes sweeping the room. But the monsters. Death was timed too precisely. Constable Harrow, let's revisit the facts. The foyer clock stopped at 11:47. Yet the tower clock, synchronized, was sabotaged later. The note, "The pendulum swings true at midnight," pointed to a plan. And tonight someone cut the clock's wire while we were all here. Why? Harrow's moustache twitched. To frame Miss Crane? Or cover their tracks? Both, Miss Marple said, her needles clicking once, a deliberate punctuation. But the key lies in the locket. Miss Crane, may I see it? Lydia hesitated, then handed over the locket, its tiny clock face gleaming at midnight. Miss Marple opened it, revealing a hidden compartment behind the clock. A folded scrap of paper, bearing the pendulum symbol and a single word, Julian. A gasp rippled through the room. Julian Drake's monocle fell, his face paling. What is this? A trick? No trick, Mr. Drake, Miss Marple said, her gaze locking onto him. You and Lydia were lovers, as village gossip confirmed. But you used her, didn't you? To get to Victor's secrets, his debts, his order of the pendulum. This note hidden in her locket was your insurance. You gave her the locket, didn't you? Julian's smirk was gone, his voice tight. Preposterous. I cared for Lydia. That locket was a gift, nothing more. Then why, Miss Marple pressed, does it name you? And why did you sabotage the tower clock, knowing its logs might show you tampering with it 2 nights ago? Clara Voss's pen hit the floor. Julian, you killed Victor. Miss Marple raised a hand, silencing the room. Let me explain. Mr. Drake was owed £10,000 by Victor, a gambling debt. But Victor's real debt was to the Order of the Pendulum, a society of collectors who dealt in forged clocks, as Miss Voss uncovered. Julian, you infiltrated their circle, posing as a debtor, but seeking their secrets. Victor was about to expose you, wasn't he? Julian's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Miss Marple continued, her voice steady as a metronome. You killed Victor in his study, using the Foucault gear to make it look like an order ritual. You stopped the foyer clock at 11:47 to confuse the time of death, knowing the tower clock, synchronized, would betray the true hour, closer to 11:30, when you were alone in the billiard room. You staged the pendulum's swing to start later, a mechanical trick you learned from Victor's manuals. Arthur Wren's eyes widened. The tower. You smashed it to hide the logs. Exactly, Miss Marple said. The logs would show. The tower clock stopped at 11:30, not 11:47. And tonight, you cut the foyer clock's wire to frame Lydia, hoping her confession would seal the case. You used her love, her fear, to make her believe she was guilty. Lydia's sobs grew louder. Julian, you told me I did it in my sleep, that I hated him. Julian lunged forward, his voice a snarl. You've no proof. This is conjecture. Miss Marple held up the locket's note. This is proof, and the tower's wreckage. Constable, you'll find a wrench in Mr. Drake's room, marked with his initials. I noticed it missing from the tool shed yesterday. Harrow nodded, signalling Graves to search. Moments later, Graves returned, holding a wrench engraved with J.D. The room erupted in murmurs. Julian's shoulders slumped, his defiance crumbling. I had to, he muttered, his voice hollow. Victor was going to sell me out to the Order. They'd have killed me. The gear, the clock, it was to scare them, to make them think one of their own turned. Lydia was collateral. Harrow cuffed him, his face grim. Julian Drake, "You're under arrest for the murder of Victor Crane." Clara scribbled furiously, her eyes alight. Reginald exhaled, relief flooding his face. Arthur clutched the contract from the attic, his family's honour partially restored. Lydia sank into a chair, her locket abandoned on the floor. Miss Marple picked it up, closing it gently. "Time," she said softly, "always betrays the guilty. The pendulum swung true, Mr. Drake, but not at midnight." As Harrow led Julian away, the manor seemed to exhale, its silence no longer oppressive. The clocks, though still, held no more secrets. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the foyer clock, its hands forever at 11:47, a testament to a truth finely wound. Chapter 10. The pendulum swings again. The fog had lifted from St. Mary's Mead, leaving the village bathed in a crisp autumn light. Pendleton Manor stood quieter now, its chimneys no longer ominous, but merely old, weathered by time. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cottage, her knitting needles clicking softly, a cup of tea steaming beside her. The events of the past days lingered, in her mind not as a burden, but as a puzzle solved, its pieces neatly aligned. In the manor, Julian Drake's arrest had unshackled the truth. Constable Harrow had uncovered further evidence in Julian's room, a hidden journal detailing his infiltration of the Order of the Pendulum, a shadowy group that, while real, was less a cult than a syndicate of greedy collectors. Julian Hadideo sought to blackmail them, using Victor Crane's forged clocks as leverage. When Victor threatened to expose him, Julian struck, his plan nearly perfect, but for the clock's relentless honesty. Lydia Crane, exonerated, had left the manor, her locket now buried in a drawer. Miss Marple had visited her before she departed, offering a gentle word. "You were a pawn, my dear," she'd said, her eyes kind. "But time heals, if you let it." Lydia's tears had been her only reply, but her shoulders were lighter as she boarded the train to London, seeking a new start. Clara Voss, her biography of Victor, now a tale of betrayal and justice, had softened toward her cousin Arthur Wren. They'd agreed to auction the Foucault gear, its proceeds funding a scholarship in Thomas Wren's name. "It's what father would have wanted," Clara had said, her voice steady for the first time in days. Arthur, clutching the contract that proved Victor's fraud, nodded. "And mother, she'd be proud." Reginald Holt, cleared of murder but not of shame, had resigned his partnership, his ledgers audited by Harrow's men. The discrepancies Clara uncovered were real, but Reginald's crime was greed, not blood. He'd slunk back to the city, his bluster deflated. Graves, ever loyal, remained at the manor, winding its clocks with a newfound reverence. Miss Marple had stopped by to thank him, noting the foyer clock's steady tick-tock, its hands no longer frozen at 11:47. "You've brought it back to life, Mr. Graves," she'd said, her smile warm. He'd blushed, a rare crack in his stoic facade. "It's what Mr. Crane would have wanted, ma'am. Time should keep moving." Now, in her cottage, Miss Marple reflected on the village's return to normalcy. The vicar's stride was brisk again, the postman's limp less pronounced. St. Mary's Mead had weathered the storm, its gossip now softened to tales of Miss Marple's cleverness rather than Victor's death. Mrs. Bantry, over tea that morning, had pressed for details. "Jane, you're a marvel! How did you know it was that Drake fellow?" Miss Marple's eyes had twinkled. People, Dolly, are like clocks. They tick in patterns. Julian's was too smooth, too calculated. The locket, the tower, the stopped clocks, they all pointed to a man who thought he could outrun time. Mrs. Bantry laughed, shaking her head. "You'll have to write it down one day, Jane. A story like that." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking. "But stories belong to the village. I only listen." As evening fell, she stepped into her garden, the air sharp with the scent of chrysanthemums. In the distance, Pendleton Manor's clock tower chimed, its repaired face gleaming under the setting sun. The sound carried across St. Mary's Mead, a reminder that time, like truth, always found its rhythm. Miss Marple smiled, her gaze on the horizon. The pendulum swung again, and all was well.